Greetings as folks trickle in. We'll kick things off here. We're so glad you could attend this month's Neon Science Seminar, which is presented by the National Science Foundation's National Ecological Observatory Network, which is operated by Battelle. Our goal with this monthly series of talks is to build community among researchers at the intersection of ecology, environmental science, and neon. We have two excellent speakers who are going to talk to us today. But before we turn it over to them, a few logistics. First, we've enabled optional automated closed captioning for today's talk. If you'd like to use it, find the CC bar in your Zoom menu, the CC button in your Zoom menu bar. This webinar will consist of a presentation followed by a Q&A session. As you think of questions, please do put them in the Q&A box. So this is different from the chat. We also have a meeting chat, and you're welcome to more sort of make comments about the talk or share links or other relevant resources with others in the group. The speakers may do that as well. If you can, try to put your technical questions for the speakers into the Q&A box. We'll leave lots of time in the end for discussion and Q&A. And there will also be an opportunity to ask questions over audio. So if you prefer that format, just think of your question. Then when we get to the Q&A, you can raise your hand in the Zoom menu bar, and then we'll unmute you and give you the opportunity to chime in. So NEON welcomes contributions from everyone who shares our values of unity, creativity, collaboration, excellence, and appreciation. This is outlined in our NEON Code of Conduct, which can be found on the Science Seminar's webpage, which I'm sharing now, also on the general NEON website, and I'm going to drop a link in the chat. So everyone just keep in mind this code of conduct does apply to NEON staff and anyone participating in a NEON event. So thank you so much for adhering to that. This talk will be recorded and made available for later viewing on the NEON Science Seminar's webpage. If you were to go there, we have the schedule of talks. And so for today's talk, there will be a link probably by the end of this week for the recording of the seminar, so you can check it out again later. And lastly, if you have ideas for a talk for this seminar series, nominate yourself or a colleague today by filling out the form again on the Science Seminar's webpage. So you'd go up here and nominate a seminar speaker. We would love to hear about your work or the work of colleagues that you think would be relevant for us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Shashi Khanduri, to introduce today's speakers.
Thanks, Sam. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce the speakers for today. Dr. Douglas Morton is a fire scientist at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center and an expert on the use of satellite, airborne, and ground-based measurements to characterize global fire activity, fire emissions, and fire impacts on ecosystems and communities. Dr. Morton leads the development of new airborne and spaceflight compact fire imagers. These next-gen instruments for fire detection and characterization leverage NASA's latest developments in sensor technology. Dr. Morton also contributes to NASA's Wildland Fire Sense program, which is a 5-year effort to harness NASA technology and scientific expertise to improve operational fire management in the US. And he also leads fire research projects from Alaska to the Amazon. Our second speaker, Eli, is a researcher at both the University of Maryland, Baltimore County and NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center as part of the G-STAR program. Originally coming from the geological sciences, Eli's research sits at the intersection of fire and water, where he works to unravel the influence of fire behavior on the subsequent risk of post-fire hydrological hazards, such as flash flooding and or mass wasting. He's also pursuing these questions as part of his ongoing doctoral research at the University of Maryland, College Park. On a personal note, I've had the pleasure of working closely with Dr. Doug Morton. Prior to joining NEON in 2022, I was a postdoctoral researcher at NASA Goddard, where I collaborated with Doug. On behalf of the entire NEON community, I would like to extend a warm welcome to both Doug and Elijah. We look forward to your talk. With that said, the stage is all yours, Eli.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Shashi, Sam, and to the rest of the NEON community. It's really a privilege to get a chance to connect with this broader network of folks that are considering the changing characteristics of ecosystems, certainly in response to effects like fire, but to climate warming and to other effects as well, as we move from scales ranging from the meter by meter quadrats all the way up to what's visible to us from space. Eli, I don't know if you want to put that up. We'll do our best to see if we can make those linkages across scales today and give you a little bit more of the perspective that we've been bringing to this topic by thinking about how we can utilize NASA and NOAA and USGS on-orbit capabilities to really understand what's happening in our changing planet. This is a map of the cumulative amount of fire activity over the course of the entire year of 2020. This helps us remember, I think, is that fires are really an everyday reality for most ecosystems across the planet, and certainly across landscapes where human domination of the use of fire for land management and land clearing is really present. What you can see in this depiction are the hotter, more intense fires showing up in whiter or lighter shades. Your eyes are probably immediately drawn to places like California or Colorado, the southeastern part of the Australian continent that had really large fires in the beginning of 2020, the arc of deforestation across the Amazon, the major burning belts in the sub-Saharan African region. But then you also see these lighter colors. These shades really represent the fact that fire is used in an intentional fashion across much of the managed landscapes. And so these ignitions are really ever present. And the question is, how are those ignitions and the fire activity that's associated with them changing in response to changes in land use and changing fire weather? Next slide, Eli. So what we're really going to try to talk about today is sort of a picture that'll help us bring the global perspective that's really uniquely possible with satellite data down to the level of impacts that are observed on, NEON sites, but also across other areas of ecosystem monitoring and management. Start with a little bit of an overview of this overall approach to fire tracking, and then focus in on some of the lessons we're learning by using the satellite-based fire tracking paradigm to dig deeper into how fires are growing and changing in episodic ways. Then I'll hand it over to Eli for a deeper dive on some of the ecosystem impacts from some of the fires in the Western United States. And then I'm excited to be able to take questions and carry out this conversation as a part of the broader community here, knowing that these are concepts and ideas. The opportunity to link remote sensing with ecological measurements on the ground is really the core of the NEON approach. And it's one that really has a lot of opportunities to connect to the satellite perspective, both in the US and beyond. We'll take it away, Eli. So I always like to set the global context. Shashi might get sick of me trying to do this, but I think it's really important that we understand the nature of fires and their changes across much of the planet. The top map here shows you an estimate of the extent of burning, the average annual extent of burning. And again, this highlights those regions where fires are widespread. Those are probably the most notable regions where fires are either in ecosystems that are fire adapted, or fire as a management tool has been encroaching on landscapes like tropical forest regions where fires are less common but are the common use for management. What may be less understood is the fact that on a global basis, the total amount of burned area is actually declining, and it has been for the last 2 decades. And I don't think that's a common perspective, at least in our focus on fires in the United States, where the picture, especially in this last several weeks, has been of the potential risk to communities in the wildland-urban interface and the devastating effects that fire can have when conditions are ripe for fast-moving and very dangerous fires. But as we look across the whole planet, what we see is actually that fires are declining, and it's widespread across grasslands and savannas. And so from an ecosystem perspective, it really poses a challenge. We're seeing less fire in those ecosystems that are fire adapted. And we're thinking about how we reintroduce fire across many landscapes under conditions that have become more fire prone. Next slide. So we actually took the opportunity in the last several years to update our estimate of the global fire extent. And it may sound like something we should have a handle on right now based on the longstanding use of satellite data to map burned area and detect active fires, as I'll talk about next. But it turns out that we're still not capturing the full footprint of fire activity around the globe. So if you compare the top map, which was our estimate from what's called the GFED4 database, to our most recent estimate, GFED5, on the map below, you'll see that there's actually an increase in burned area in almost every continent. About 60% more burned area on average in our updated data set. That's based on the use of new higher resolution satellite data like Landsat and Sentinel-2 as a way to calibrate and characterize often fires that are burning in smaller fire events or in fragmented landscapes that are just difficult for us to detect with our orbital satellite capabilities. What's interesting, though, is that the trend remains. So even though we've increased our estimate of the total global area burning by over 60%, we still see a 1.2% per year decline since 2000. Next slide. And as I mentioned, we're obviously aware that there's an increase in awareness in the potential for fires to grow hotter, faster, and longer under warming conditions. We've seen recent papers that are really focused in on the anomalous behavior of fires burning intensely in the overnight hours, faster fires that pose a threat to communities, as we just saw in the LA region. We saw it previously in Lahaina, and we will see again, whether it's Portugal or Australia or Greece or the United States. And those impacts from large, long-lived fires have a devastating effect on the structure and composition of ecosystems, including biodiversity. Our group mapped out what we thought were the extent of those individual fire units back in 2019 in something called the Global Fire Atlas. And this map on the right shows you those areas that we've identified as having the largest fires on the top, the longest fires in the middle panel, and the fastest fires burning on the bottom. And it's really important that we were able to help understand what you might call pyromes, or the pyrogeography, and how it's changing over time. This was sort of our initial foray into be able to better understand the characteristics of fires that burned across these landscapes. And I bring it up because, again, the majority of the world's burned area occurs in fires that last for more than one day. You just don't burn a large enough area to be a significant contribution to the total without burning for days or weeks, or in some cases, months. This panel in the middle shows fires that lasted for longer than 60 days. Next slide. So our interest in this conversation is about how do we help zero in on an individual fire event, understand its changing behavior in terms of the spread rate, the intensity, the direction, and then what is that set of characteristics? How does each individual fire event grow and evolve? And what is the imprint of those changes in fire behavior on the landscape? So we're part of a project team that's trying to look at fires through the entire fire life cycle, from the pre-fire characteristics that promote large or intense wildfires, to the active fire detecting and tracking, which is something we'll focus on next, to the post-fire effects, which is the part that Eli will talk about. All of that is focused on our ability to better understand and prepare for future fires, as well as to help characterize what the imprint of fire is on ecosystems and on greenhouse gases. Next slide. This is an example that will help characterize the way in which we're able to utilize satellite data to track the growth of a large fire. This is the Caldor fire that burned for almost 50 days in 2021. And what these individual red points represent are the active fire detections. As we have satellites that overpass every 12 hours, we're able to track the position and intensity of actively burning areas of the fire. We're also able to then identify the portions of the fire perimeter that are expanding. And what we're left with at the end of this entire monitoring is to see not only the areas where the front expanded, the time periods where the gaps between those 12-hour fire fronts are the largest, showing areas of rapid fire growth or more intense burning. We're also able to characterize the residual amount of combustion that happens within the fire perimeter, those areas that potentially have higher fuel loads or where higher moisture content prevents an immediate burn, but that continue to flame and smolder over the lifetime of these large fires. And so what you'll see here, again, in terms of representing this large fire event, is that the fire was expanding for about half of its lifetime, and the fire was burning within its perimeter for the remainder of this fire lifetime. And those two parts of the fire are really important if we're going to understand the total amount of combustion, the severity of that fire in terms of its impacts on vegetation and soils, and the carbon release associated with an individual fire event. So this is the perspective we're bringing now. Can we track every fire that we can see from space every 12 hours? And can we help deliver that to both the ecological community to understand the changing nature of fire behavior, and to the operational community that's relied on satellite data for their awareness? Next slide. So this is an approach that we first piloted in California. It's called FEDS. I've got a QR code here that'll take you to the data sets that are released on the NASA Fire Information Resource Management System, or FIRMS. And what we have in this case is sort of a depiction of all of the fires that we tracked in real time in 2024. Eli, I think you may have to click once more. We can take a look at some of the areas that had large and notable fires, from the Jennings fire in New York City, one region that is not usually accustomed to having large, long-lived fires, to the northern patch of burning, which again, 2024 was a very anomalous fire year for Canadian boreal forests. And then a large outbreak of fires in Idaho, including the Wapiti fire and others. And these individual pink lines show you those same 12-hour fire perimeters and our ability to characterize the patterns of fire growth and change over time. So this is an activity that we've taken now out of the science realm, and we're bringing it into the more operational use, because again, in many of these landscapes, satellite data are still a really important way that we can characterize fires, both the new ignitions that begin and their behavior over time, because there are thousands of large fires that we observed last year across North America. And not all of them have other resources available in terms of ground measurements, firefighting, or even airborne reconnaissance to understand the changes in fire extent. Next slide. So this is going to jump now from North America down to South America. And I wanted to share this example because it really represents the need for this kind of information to understand the role of fire for changing ecosystems across the planet. This large fire complex burned for more than 100 days. It burned more than 10 million acres. 10 million acres. And it was started from 80 or more individual fire events that ultimately merged into this massive complex. This burned in the Chiquitania and Amazon forest region of Santa Cruz Department in Bolivia, and it represents probably the biggest fire that burned last year that no one's ever heard of. Next slide, please. And what this really represents for us is an opportunity to understand the growth and evolution of these conditions. How do landscapes become more flammable that permit these large clusters of fires, either through lightning ignitions or through the areas of land use, like in this region of Bolivia, to ultimately grow into these mega fires? What I've starred here and then showed on the panels on the right are 2 days when the active fire line, this would be the area of flaming front of expanding fires, was more than 1,000 linear kilometers. And on that peak day, the linear length of the fire line was over 1,800 kilometers. That's like driving from Boulder to Indianapolis. Just imagine if that entire interstate was flaming at the exact same time, and what an overwhelming response would be needed to help contain and to suppress a fire of that magnitude. So as these fires grow large, their fire lines grow in ways that are exponential in response to their area, and they create massive problems in terms of management and achieving ecosystem management goals. So here's an example that I just wanted to share in terms of how we're exploring the role of individual fires and their potential both to grow large, as well as to do unprecedented amounts of damage in ecosystems where fire return intervals are becoming shorter and shorter. Next slide. The other way that our group has been trying to approach this understanding of individual large fire behavior is by looking across regions where there are more consistent fire weather conditions. So this is an analysis that's nearing submission, led by Tess McCabe, who's a postdoc in our group. And this represents the extent of the large fires on the left in 2023 that burned in Quebec. And on the right, what you see is a line for each of the individual large fires. They're organized here by latitude from south to north. The color scale in the middle panel shows you their daily estimated fire growth. So this shows you how much that individual fire event grew on any given day. And one of the things that really jumps out, even before I tell you the rest of the plot, is how coordinated or synchronized the growth of large fire events were across the entire province of Quebec. The top and the bottom curves show you an estimate from our model of the fire weather index, which is a combined index that tries to capture both the long memory of slow fuel drying in large fuels or soils and the fast fuel dryness that's associated with surface litter. That combined index is used in Canada as their preparedness for the potential for large fires. What you can see here is a relatively coordinated or synchronized response for fires in the sim geographies. So periods of rapid fire growth were synchronized across large fires. And again, as an ecologist, that isn't necessarily the first way that we would look at this problem. There's a heavy focus on either fine scale characteristics of fire weather like wind, or of fuels and fuel variability or topography as a major driver of fire growth. And what we see in this case across this very large extent is the really important role that fire weather played in synchronizing the growth of these unprecedented large fires in 2023. Next slide. We're also working to help better understand the nature of these large fire events and their potential to generate unprecedented amounts of smoke emissions. Or in this case, we're looking at the Creek Fire, which I understand is of interest to the Neon community as it burned into the extent of the Soap Root Saddle site, which generated a large pyro-CB event or pyrocumulonimbus cloud, essentially a deep injection of smoke because there was enough energy at the surface and entrainment from the surface to allow smoke and trace gas aerosols, other components of that plume, to be injected directly into the stratosphere. The reason we're focused on this is because when you have very dense cold clouds, we don't see the surface. And we're probably missing some critical times to understand the most extreme fire behavior with our current algorithms and satellite algorithms. And that's just what happened there on September 6th, when there are no red detections, which would be the standard product from the VIIRS algorithm, but there is still a heat signature. If you look at the bottom row, the 4-micron brightness channel is one of the key factors that we use to identify fires. And we can still identify some of that heat energy underneath the taller smoke plume. I'm going to jump ahead, but I'm happy to come back and explain the details. We'll go to the next slide. What's really important for us is to better understand the total duration of fire activity. And what these blue additional fire detections represent are our opportunity to understand the persistence or the continuous amount of burning that happens for any given pixel within a large fire, whether that's happening because of lower intensity smoldering that's otherwise not detected by our algorithm, or it's happening under clouds or smoke cover, which prevents us from having a clear look at the surface and a confident detection of an active fire. But you can see that in each of these cases, we're getting another 15 to 20% of the detections associated with these large fire complexes when we dig deeper into the satellite data to help better track the time evolution of the burning event. Next slide. And I really just want to leave it here in the sense that it's so important for us to better understand the potential that fires are burning longer or smoldering or flaming longer in the same location, because it's likely to increase the total combustion completeness. It's likely to increase the influence of fire residence time on both vegetation, say tree mortality, or surface soils and their hydrophobicity. And what I'll point your attention to here is just that middle panel on the bottom labeled F, which shows you the difference in our estimate of the total fire persistence, whether we include or don't include those candidate fire detections. And those areas that are highlighted as having an additional 2, 3, or 4 12-hour time steps with fire detections are in areas that we identify as having heavier fuel loads. And we're doing additional work to better understand the nature of that long duration burning activity and what it means for enriching the release of reduced gases like carbon monoxide and for particulate matter formation. So I'm going to leave it there and hand it over to Eli, and happy to come back at the end for some more discussion.
Thank you so much, Doug. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Fantastic. So Doug, thank you so much. And thank you so much to this group for having me. As I mentioned in the introduction, I come from a rock background in the geological sciences. And I have to say that I have really been grateful to have been a part of this community as I'm learning more about ecology and the role that vegetation plays for all of these processes. So this is very much a learning experience for me, and it's one that I'm very, very grateful for. So as Doug had very much helped set the stage here, I am really focused on how everything that he presented goes into this post-fire environment. And I'm particularly concerned about natural hazards that are typically induced from precipitation, whether those are runoff-driven debris flows, infiltration-driven landslides, or flash floods. Hopefully, I don't need to state the importance that these events have on human life and property, but if you can trust me, these are things that oftentimes we are quite worried about. So my overall research question that I want to cover for the back half of this talk is, how do these metrics of fire behavior that we can capture through satellite-based tracking, how do these relate back to burn severity, as well as how long it takes for an environment to recover? Importantly, I'm also trying to think about the entire fire life cycle. So I want to first understand, well, how do these fuel loads, fire weather, how do all these set the stage for the burning that might occur? And ultimately, when the fire does end up going off, how do the properties that we are measuring, say, if you were from a fire modeling perspective, it would be, say, flame length. In this case, we're tracking that as a proxy through fire radiative power. How does fire radiative power vary as a function of these pre-fire fuel loads or the weather that's synchronous with burning? And ultimately, how do all of these factors lead into that post-fire environment? What is it about these fuel loads? Is it something that mitigates, or is it something that promotes large fire residence times, which then lead to greater burning in the soil column? For instance, trying to link that vegetation-based approach to soil hydrophobicity, it helps us have a better understanding of what or how water might move throughout the landscape once a fire is extinguished. And so one of the ways we've been approaching this is that we take this fire tracking algorithm, and we apply it to the entire Western United States from the years of 2013 to 2021. When we match this with other data sources, such as the monitoring trends and burn severity data, we can identify over 1,700 large wildfires. And then if we break that up into individual periods of 12 hours spread, that gives us over 50,000 data points to try to learn from. And so as I investigate these relationships between active fire behavior and burn severity, you might have heard of this Monitoring Trends in Burn Severity Dataset, or MTBS. It is a standard federal program that both maps the extent of wildfires as well as tries to infer the impacts on vegetation. The burn severity categories range from 1 to 4 in increasing severity, and I will go into that in a little bit more depth in just a second for how these categories relate back to fire behavior. So a very important step before I can show you the results is understanding how we're trying to link active fire behavior to the post-fire environment. And so what I have here is an example from the creek fire. You saw just a few slides earlier. And so at an arbitrary point, I'm going to call it time 0, which happened to be early in the fire life cycle, where what you see here is the perimeter mapped out as it was from the start of the fire to this current point in time. So these are detections in black. Now, between the hours of 1:30 p.m., which is when this original perimeter was drawn, to 1:30 a.m., the next 12-hour period on September 8th, you'll see in red these new detections. And what we're able to do, obviously, is we can see just how much the fire grew in all these different directions. And you'll also notice that you see both red detections making new areas of fire growth, but even behind the previous fire perimeter, you still see areas of persistent burning. And ultimately, if we take the geometric difference between these two, we're able to break out these individual periods of 12-hour fire spread. So once more, this is detailing spread which occurred between the afternoon of September 7th and the early morning hours of September 8th. From there, because these are distinct polygons in geospatial and any sort of geospatial software of your choice, we can start overlaying the raster-based burn severity values and start looking at how burn severity varies within these individual polygons. And for these purposes, I will be using the median burn severity class. When we break up individual burn severity values by vegetation type, because we do want to think about that pre-fire context, what is actually burning, it's hopefully I don't have to draw it out too much, that you see this obvious relationship between the intensity of the fire and the overall burn severity value given to it 2 weeks to 1 year later, depending on when the mapping occurred. And so what I'm showing at the top is the total fire radiated power. So that's the sum of all the energy we were able to measure over subsequent overpass periods divided by the total area, so per unit area. And so regardless of the vegetation type, we see this increasing relationship between fire intensity and this total burn severity. So for a lot of you, that might already be intuitive. One of the ways you can think about this is that oftentimes we're able to characterize these values weeks before a fire is over. So we can already get preemptive understanding of what the landscape might look like before suppression has even occurred. Another way to look at this is just the mean FRP, so not thinking about it per unit area. We see a similar relationship. And ultimately, we see a, dare I say, a little bit more confusing, less consistent relationship between the rate of fire spread and burn severity. This is something I'll talk about in more detail, but it also shows that we aren't always just seeing linearly increasing relationships between commonly measured active fire behavior or properties of active fire behavior and burn severity. There's oftentimes more to the story that we have to dig into. Another way we can think about this without even factoring into burn severity is just making sure we understand how fire behavior relates as a function of that pre-fire type. In this case, I'm breaking out all these 50,000 individual periods of 12-hour spread into their dominant land cover type. And already we see different ways that through satellite-based tracking, we can actually measure the different ways the fire will interact with a given landscape. Obviously, you can do this with fire behavior models. And so we are taking an empirically based approach. We're taking data that we are actually observing from space. So we see that higher fueled systems such as conifer forests don't burn quite as quickly as shrubland environments, and then grassland environments sit somewhere in between. We can do something similar where we also think about fire residence time or fire persistence. And so in this case, if we look at the number of unique 12-hour pixel detections, for each land cover type, we indeed see that these higher fuel load systems such as conifers will burn longer. This is important context because if we're just tracking these pixels from space, but don't have a good understanding of what is actually burning, we are already not getting enough information we can about the landscape and being able to predict these processes. One last way I wanted to represent this was just taking the difference between in hours from the first pixel detection and the last pixel detection. You might see that there are some are longer tails where there are certain parts of conifer forests that appear to burn for a very long time. Sometimes these spread areas are quite large, so you might see these inflated values as a function of just the large area that we might be tracking within a 12-hour period. Nonetheless, we see these expected trends where higher fuel load systems are indeed burning longer than, say, these shrubland or grassland counterparts. What really excites me about this work is that we can take all of these properties, say the pre-fire context or related to land cover, and the active fire properties, and we can come up with an empirically based predictive model of burn severity. This is really important for fires like the Dixie Fire, which lasted for over 2 months. And so if you are concerned when these megafires are occurring, if you are tasked with responding to these emergencies, if you are the burn area emergency response team that needs to think about hill slope treatment strategies to prevent erosion, the idea is that you want to have information and valuable information as quickly as you can. And so by integrating this active fire data into an empirical model with land cover data, we can actually begin to predict these periods of 12-hour spread and get a sense of what this landscape might look like before traditional burn severity classifications might occur. And so with this example with the Dixie Fire, over 70% of the total burn area, we were able to correctly predict in terms of its burn severity value, which means that we were able to already demonstrate the ability for active fire tracking in this pre-fire context to provide guidance during active fire events where timely information is essential for making important, perhaps life altering decisions. Now, I want to get to one part of the talk that is oftentimes where I personally am finding the most amount of insight, and also where I am sometimes scratching my head the most. And so I want to take you back to this earlier figure and walk you through how we're tracking these fires. As I mentioned earlier, what you're seeing here is the difference between the September 7th afternoon overpass and the September 8th early morning overpass. And so what we see here is that this area of spread is typically assigned what we would call an AM value. This part of the fire was first detected in the early morning hours. However, there was 12 hours that occurred between these subsequent overpasses. And so what we're really representing here is that this is how much the fire grew between 1:30 p.m. and 1:30 a.m. The consensus in fire literature is that oftentimes you will see the peak of burning in the late afternoon. And so between the hours of 1:30 p.m. and 1:30 a.m., these hours of peak and the highest intensity burning is likely occurring, and we're unable to see that. This makes for some very interesting figures when we try to characterize the diurnal cycle of fire activity as a function of burn severity. So what you'll see here is that if we just look at the initial FRP over the spread area, so this means that this is the intensity per unit area just as it was first observed. For periods that we mark as AM, again, that's between the hours of 1:30 p.m. and 1:30 a.m., you can see just how much lower these intensity values are, despite the fact that you see burn severity, high burn severity values are still represented regardless of their initial detection. And apologies, I meant to note earlier that these bar widths are proportional to the sample size. So anywhere that you see near equal width bars, you can imagine those sample sizes are nearly identical. So what this is saying is that regardless of the initial detection period we have, whether it was first detected in the afternoon or that spread was first detected in the early morning, these high severity values are still nearly equally represented in our extremely large data set. And so if we then consider the lifetime of the fire, so how did everything progress beyond that initial detection? One thing you'll see is that there begins to be this much more, an evening out of these ratios. Nonetheless, you see lower burn severity values, lower intensity values associated with early morning spread. But nonetheless, this really starts to equal out. You might also notice that in the subsequent land cover types, we see similar, however, not identical, trends, where in each case, or most cases, I'll say, you'll see that despite initial differences in intensity values, we see this progressive evening out. And I will talk about some of the outliers here. But one of the takeaways is that we indeed struggle to capture this signal. It is hard for us to really break down the diurnal variability using the 12-hour cadence of these VIIR sensors, largely because their overpass times do not always correspond with the things that we, as folks interested in active fire behavior, are most interested in. Nonetheless, we can start to glean some really useful insights. And so I mentioned this idea of fire persistence. One of the things that we see here is that even if in a hypothetical scenario, burning is not super intense on the initial observation period, by noticing how in each case we have this progressive evening out of total intensity values. This shows that this tells us that despite the fact that we are mixing this signal, we still see clear evidence of the role of fire persistence on burn severity values. What this means is that because the fire line has moved on from a given area, just because it's already initially burned through a given place and is in other parts, that residual burning, the subsequent burning that might occur in the days following, can have crucial impacts on how we think about burn severity and the potential hydrological hazards, or as an ecologist, impacts to ecosystems that occur afterwards. So we want to stay in these areas. And so just because the fire has moved on doesn't mean we want to focus on where it's actively burning. We need to continue to think about what's going on inside the fire perimeter because so much change is still occurring. One more way that I want to talk about diurnal variability is thinking about spread area. And this is where that mixing of signals becomes most apparent. You might notice these solid lines again correspond to spread between the afternoon and in the early morning with first detection in the morning. And so the fact that the AM values we see are consistently larger than what we call the PM values tells us that there's so much extra spread that's occurring between these overpass hours. And it's something that we're not able to see. But it once again helps demonstrate this diurnal behavior of fires as they evolve. They're spreading more in the afternoon. They're slowing down their pace in the early morning hours. Clearly, those vary as a function of both land cover, topography, and fire weather, but you nonetheless see this pattern. One of the things that I personally find the most interesting is if we try to represent the difference in the median spread as a function of this of a ratio. So here I'm taking the 50th percentile, so the median of either AM or PM spread as a function of both burn severity class and vegetation type. What I really want to point you to is that if you look at in this conifer side, you see if for both conifers and shrublands, you end up seeing this progressive increase in diurnal imbalance. There's greater spread in the what appears to be in the gap between afternoon and morning overpasses, which tells us that as your severity increases, you're oftentimes seeing more lopsided fire spread behavior. And where I think this is most notable is actually in the shrubland environment, in this dark red, which is the highest burn severity category. Not only is this the larger difference where after, this inferred period of growth between 1:30 p.m. and 1:30 a.m. So even though it's linked as a.m., it really is suggestive of the growth that occurred between the afternoon and the morning. It's actually twice as large during that period than the subsequent overpass between the early morning hours and the early afternoon. So if I were to just go back one more slide, you might also notice that in the total FRP per spread area in this high severity class, you also see the largest difference in these total FRP values, which I've been able to interpret as this is where large, intense spread is occurring. So fast, high intensity spread is occurring that's leading to these high burn severity values, but something that we are unable to capture with the current constellation of satellites. And so I just gave you a large overview. In the last few minutes, I want to pivot to a site in New Mexico. This is a project that I'm working on with both USGS as well as the US Forest Service. There are a lot of agencies here right now. And this takes place in the mountains of New Mexico in the Northeast. And this was the 2022 Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire. This is the largest wildfire in New Mexico's history. And what I'm showing here is both the way that we were able to track the expansion of this fire as it was occurring, as well as the cadence of more traditional burn severity mapping sources, such as the Harmonized Landsat Sentinel Dataset, or HLS, and how you might do traditional spectral-based burn severity mapping using DNBR. And I really want to highlight here how the two datasets are complementary of one another, and how the initial much lower latency measures, near real-time measures from our feds tracking complements the higher resolution but higher latency traditional spectral metrics such as DNBR. Within this very large burn scar, I and a number of researchers at other agencies are focused on this watershed called the Las Gallinas watershed. It's quite large. It's nearly 200 square kilometers. And there's a long-standing gauge from the USGS that has provided over 3 decades of streamflow observations. So this is a really great area, and great is in for scientific opportunity. This is an area where we can do a good job characterizing both the pre-fire hydrological characteristics as well as the post-fire hydrologic characteristics with a really strong eye into trying to understand how the returning vegetation mitigates the streamflow properties that we observe. So in this project, we're monitoring both streamflow and vegetation recovery, and then we are ultimately trying to link this with the event-based tracking that we have with feds. And as ecologists, you know better than most, the idea of recovery very much depends on the context, depends on the questions you're wanting to ask. So we could be talking about hydrologic recovery. Is the river flowing as we would expect it to be in the 7 years after a fire? Or is it still really flashy? Well, if we're thinking about vegetation recovery, also 7 years might not be enough. Will a forest ever be fully recovered? It could take decades for that to occur. And then also we want to think about human recovery. This was a large event. It was a very, very scary and traumatic event for the residents that lived proximal to this burn scar. We also want to think about the natural resilience that humans have to these natural hazards and how the scientific insights from these events can help us better respond to the risk of these subsequent hazards. And so while I'll just be focusing on the first two, I really want to mention that recovery is a term that we need to always be very precise about, but it's one that goes just beyond the science that we're immediately focused on here. So to keep things brief, one thing I'll say is that as we look at stream flow in this area, and we're still continuing to do this, one of the things I want to draw your attention to is that as these lines in each post-fire year go progressively further up and to the right, this means that there's higher stream flow for any given area. And so this means that this watershed is in the immediate post-fire year was much flashier. There was so much more water coming into the river as it was raining than in the pre-fire, what we would consider normal from that prolonged gauge record. Even though there are some variations, say that in the post-fire year 1, that was a drier point, but then even in this most recent year of 2024, we still see these elevated rates of stream flow, even as they are going down. If we were to compare this with vegetation recovery, which I think as both is very interesting to me and hopefully this audience, one of the things that we see in both remote sensing based metrics as well as in the field, we can see how remote sensing can characterize how vegetation might vary as a function of the growing season. And so in the pre-fire scenario, this was a pretty densely forested environment. And what we see is that if you're familiar with the NDVI, a measure of greenness, oftentimes used as a proxy of vegetation health, you will see indeed that there's a more consistent NDVI signal, in this case, indicating a evergreen forest canopy structure. And then in the immediate post-fire environment, we'll see this requisite drop in NDVI, indicating which is very indicative of the disturbance. But what I really want to point you to is that just from the remote sensing, we start to see a seasonal signal where what we eventually through field observation can infer as the returning ground cover, and how you see this seasonal bump in vegetation that starts in the early part of the growing season, peaks in the middle, and slowly goes down near the end of the growing season. And we can see how that increases over a fire year. Now, if you use different sorts of remote sensing metrics, such as NDVI, and sources such as Landsat or Sentinel, oftentimes when we want to think about an environment, we ask ourselves, well, how can we quantify this? Do we take the minimum NDVI, the maximum NDVI? Do we try to take the difference between those two? And so what I propose is that we actually try to integrate over this growing season time series. So this would become a metric that's sensitive to both the abundance of vegetation, which we can infer as fractional cover, as well as the persistence of it throughout the growing season. And as I mentioned earlier, you'll see that even in just this past year, as we were in the field, oftentimes you will see that this seasonal signal is indicative of the returning ground cover for this environment. So I'll just quantify these values here. You see that the pre-fire year had a value of 73, 34, 47, 53. If you're asking yourself, what could these values mean? What physical interpretation of these values are there? I ask myself the same thing. And importantly, even as this does not in itself serve as a strong physically indicative metric, when we start to think about the ratio of these values from the pre-fire scenario, we start to see some very apparent trends. And so now I'm just taking the ratio from each post-fire year to the pre-fire year, these integrated NDVI values. So a value of 1 indicates greater recovery. We're getting closer to that normal value. And then anywhere below that indicates somewhere in between, on still recovering. And so, as expected in the immediate post-fire year, there are significant differences in these ratios. But over time, you see how these values start to become more and more equalized. Importantly, by doing this and breaking this down by individual small catchments or hill slopes, we can really start to highlight the areas that are not recovering as quickly as others. And importantly, even as the hydrological measurements indicate that this watershed is overall getting closer and closer to normal, so something I wasn't able to display earlier was that in each year, it's taking longer and longer for your stream flow to reach its peak. And so after a given rainfall event, you would expect more water would make its way to the river channel, you would reach some sort of peak discharge value, and then it would eventually go down. Each year, it's taking us longer and longer from the onset of rainfall to that peak discharge value, which tells us that as this returning ground cover signal is evident in these maps, we see that this is concurrent with it taking longer for water to make its way through the system. So this is an inherent link between returning ground cover, returning vegetation, the ecological importance of I say early successional species, if I'm using that term correctly, and how we think about the persistence and risk of hydrological hazards in the post-fire environment. And in this case, despite these overall trends, we're able to better understand these, what we would call problem areas, areas that aren't recovering as quickly as others, which might require further investigation, and whose geospatial context allows us to think about what this means for those nearby that might be in the way of any hydrological hazards that could occur. Now, I regret to say that this is not hypothetical. Even 2 years later, we see these issues occurring. And so even just 6 months ago, there was another rainfall event. It moved so much sediment throughout this watershed, and it actually threatened the drinking water to the point that, as this publication reports, there is a water crisis. FEMA is still in this area. And so even today, 2 years later, identifying these problem areas helps us understand the sources of these ongoing hydrological issues, which ultimately are becoming increasingly mediated by this returning vegetation. So I'm going to wrap up and hand off to Doug, and I want to just leave one more slide. You all are probably familiar with this traditional recovery model. You have a pre-fire scenario, you have the disturbance, and then you have this post-perturbation recovery period. I really want to make the note here that you have, the fire might occur in this arbitrary period of time, and then there's this gap before the assessments can start being made. There's one thing you take away from this talk. I want it to be that there's so much more we can do within what I call this critical fire tracking window. There's usually time between the onset of the disaster and when we can assess its impacts. And fire tracking allows us to really get ahead of that. It's this next frontier of research we can do to predict the post-fire effects. And that obviously means we also need to understand the pre-fire context. And importantly, the returning plants, the thing that I used to write off as the rock kid in college, these returning plants are so, so important for understanding both the initial risk of hydrological hazards, as well as just how long they persist in the landscape. How long we need to worry about this impact to human life and property. And so there will be a lot of future work that goes into doing a better job to quantify these, and also that we've only scratched the surface. So with that, I'll pass it back off to Doug, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Eli. I feel like we probably hit these conclusions along the way. I'd actually rather maybe jump to the last slide and share some other next steps and some potential connections here. There's quite a bit of interest in terms of our ability to do remote sensing at the scale of individual trees, and that's an area where NEON and the AOP have been really active. I think there's also quite a bit of interest in our understanding of the spatial characteristics of processes, and the framework that Eli and I shared with you today is the idea of understanding the within fire variability associated with the timing and duration of burning, timing, duration, and intensity of burning. We're also aware that there are novel disturbance regimes in the context of these landscapes burning more frequently or more intensely, as well as novel contributions to the combustion process through invasive species and other novel mixtures. I want to make two other quick points here, and that is that NASA's Fire Sense program, a program that just started last year, is making a 5-year investment in science and partnership to better understand the way in which we can transfer our knowledge and our technology to aid operational fire management. This is an area where there's open opportunities for collaboration. There are both opportunities for proposals as well as new areas that are being supported, like this fire tech program, which is designed to help focus in on the need for the development and demonstration of new technology. I'll just mention one of those, which is a project that I'm involved with to fly a drone under the forest canopy to map surface fuels and ladder fuels at a watershed scale. Something that today is done in neon plots with line intersect sampling, which is a really important way to be able to track the characteristics of individual fuel events over time or fuel components over time. But it doesn't provide us the spatial pattern of fuel abundance and fuel characteristics that may be really critical if we're going to understand both fire risk, the ability for a fire to transition from a surface fire to a crown fire, and the potential for this long duration smoldering and flaming, which tends to be a source of particulate matter for both the surrounding community and areas downwind. So I'm going to leave it there. I know we're maybe running a little short, but I'd love some questions if there's any in the audience. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity to present some of this work today. And I look forward to the opportunity to find more points of collaboration with the NEON community. Thanks.
Thanks, Doug and Eli. I see we have a couple of questions in the chat. The first question is by Olivia. What's the smallest fire size this satellite technology can detect? I mostly work with MTBS fire perimeter data that does not include fires less than 400 hectares.
It's a great question, and it's probably worth another seminar at some point. But an actively burning fire can be very small because the energy release is so intense that you could have a fire that's half the size of a tennis court, and we would see it. In terms of burned area, that's where the ability to definitively determine that the disturbance we see in the satellite imagery is associated with fire and not with other processes, like say harvest of an agricultural field or land clearing that occurred without fire, makes that more challenging. But we're working to continue to push towards the ability to identify smaller and smaller fires. And as I mentioned in our global assessment, as we look, we're finding that those smaller fires add up in landscapes like the United States, where every year, on average, we have as much burning east of the Mississippi as we do west of the Mississippi.
We have another question by India. Hi there, great talk, thank you. I was wondering if you could expand more on detecting fires burning under cloud cover or smoke.
Maybe I'll quickly take that one, and Neil, I'll let you jump in if you have another comment. What happens in the context of smoke is that we're looking at the thermal signature of a fire, right? The energy that's released from the combustion process. So it's a temperature measurement, and we specifically look in a range where the temperature energy release is concentrated for fires near the 4-micron range. Cold clouds above a warm fire essentially intercepts and confuses some of that signal, makes it harder for us to be able to identify the anomaly, really is what we're looking for. We're looking for areas that are hotter than their neighbors. And by having cloud cover or dense smoke, essentially you make a more, you equilibrate the temperature retrievals over the fire and its surroundings. And so we're less confident that we're seeing a fire. The approach that we took in the paper that's under review is to essentially utilize some of the time information to dig deeper into landscapes that we know are ongoing large fire events. So we're not looking for those signatures under fire, under clouds everywhere. We're looking for those signatures of residual burning in areas where we know there's an ongoing fire event.
I don't see any more questions.
I know, I was going to ask one, but I really don't think we have enough time because that's so interesting to see all these new novel metrics and ways of characterizing both spread and then what's going on beyond the fire line. And you kind of alluded to this would obviously affect ecology of the recovery. But I was sort of wondering, are you all collaborating with people doing that work, or are people, looking at, could you take like the neon beetle data that's spatially explicit and relate it to some of your metrics? Is the ecological dynamics post-fire predictable from some of these new metrics you're deriving? In 2 minutes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we certainly think so, but it does require that we're digging into, high resolution, repeat LiDAR, the kind of information that's collected on neon sites. And so it's very exciting. Actually, Shashi and I looked for a bit at the Soap-Root saddle data to understand whether the influence of the creek fire was something that was discernible there. I think what we're starting to appreciate is the need for higher and higher resolution data. We got asked about small fires. I'd ask about, higher resolution LiDAR data. Everyone always wants a little bit more detail. But when you're talking about the ability to characterize whether an individual tree or shrub was damaged, burned, or killed by a fire, you really do depend on having very high resolution information. And so what I think is actually going to be important for us here is to bring this perspective combined with field data and airborne remote sensing like the AOP data that will allow us to explore this. Is some of the variability that we see in the post-fire environment really related to the fire behavior that we're able to now describe in more detail with the satellite measurements?
Exciting frontier. Okay. We are about out of time. So thank you for a wonderful and very thought-provoking presentation. We really appreciate you coming and talking about your work with us, Elijah and Doug. Next week, we're going to have a talk more from a community ecology perspective, so probably a different scale, but that should be interesting. I put the link in the chat. We'd love to have you join us again. Thanks again to our speakers. Everyone have a great day, and we'll see you next